Chapter 2. Grief. The death of a loved one is a heart-shattering experience, not because of his transition to a fuller and more complete life, but because of our sense of separation, loneliness, and loss. One day he is with us in the flesh, the next day he is gone. Grief is the most distressing of all human problems because nothing on the material plane can lessen it. The solution lies in a complete catharsis or clarification. One of our difficulties is that we are unprepared when sorrow comes. We buy life insurance and we make wills, but we do not protect ourselves against the shock of grief. We are like the farmer who puts lightning rods on his barn after the lightning strikes. It is the time of our strength, health, and happiness that we must prepare for sorrow. But when life moves along serenely and smoothly, the necessity of preparing for bereavement does not often occur to us, yet there is nothing more certain in human life. Sorrow is inevitable, and we should prepare for it just as we prepare for college and old age. We should prepare for it by building within ourselves a deep faith in the unity and continuity of all life. Those who are prepared for sorrow suffer infinitely less than those who do not. A certain minister, on the day after the funeral of his only son, filled the speaking engagements which were a part of his duties. His friend said to him, "How can you carry on so soon after the death of your son?" Note his reply. "Years ago my wife and I talked these things out. We reasoned that life would not always be sweet, that life would not always be pleasant. We knew that there would be dark and bleak days, and seemingly not a ray of light would be seen. We decided that in the days of our freedom from sorrow we would build into our lives enough faith, hope, confidence, and trust in God to give us something on which to stand when sorrow came upon us." It was the power resultant from that decision which upheld him in the loss of his child. Uncontrolled grief is one of the most injurious emotions in human life. It will not only destroy health and impair efficiency, but will also bring poverty. Socrates said, "He that grieves much is a magnet to attract waste of property." Those who give way to grief often suffer not only the loss of material possessions and health, but other negative ills as well. Does that sound like an exaggeration? Then ask those who have become confirmed invalids through grief. Ask the arthritic and rheumatic patients. They are often the people who were unprepared for sorrow. When death came, they were overwhelmed by it. They had nothing to stand on, nothing to bear them up. If you cannot rise above sorrow when it comes, you lay yourself open to the waste and disintegration which it brings. Have you ever analyzed grief? Then do so now. Grief is a negative emotion, and like other emotion, it demands expression. It cannot be suppressed, destroyed, denied, or delayed. The person who stoically refuses to express his grief only complicates it. He pushes it down into the subconscious mind where it gathers power like steam confined in a boiler. Unexpressed grief results in shattered nerves. Disposing of all the personal effects of a loved one does not solve the problem of sorrow any more than refusing to think about him does. Emotion not only demands expression, it demands action. It must be dealt with scientifically and spiritually. It is a force with which we must do something. Fortunately, it can be sublimated, that is, turned to a constructive purpose. We can use it to deepen faith, expand vision, and to recreate and enrich life. We can use it to make the lives of others happier and more complete. Yes, I know, this is easier said than done, but there is no other way. You must overcome your grief, or else you must pay the penalty. The reason grief is so difficult to handle is that we are unable to change the cause. In metaphysics we say, change the cause and you change the effect. The exception to this rule is grief. We cannot change the cause of sorrow, for we cannot restore him whose loss brought the sorrow on. What we must do is to change our reaction to our loss. If reaction determines the result, to change the reaction is to change the effect. The thing most grief-stricken persons do not understand is they are not dealing with the seeming tragedy that has befallen them, but with their thoughts about what has happened. It is your thought about death that makes you sad and not death itself. Underscore the words in the preceding sentence. Read them over many times. This understanding puts the responsibility of grief entirely up to the individual. When your sad thoughts and morbid memories have been erased, the pain of grief will lessen and finally disappear. Death is not a unique phenomena. It is not something that occurs only in your experience. Everyone at some time in his life loses someone near and dear to him. Everyone dies at some time. Death is as natural and universal as birth, and just as important. Grief will restore no one to life. Grief will bring no one comfort. Grief only saddens and distresses our friends. Those who refuse to be comforted in sorrow are, by their morbidity, bringing disease and discomfort to their bodies. Why not face this matter squarely? Why not stop right now and ask yourself what you are really grieving about? Does a mother grieve over the graduation of a son or daughter? does a man grieve over a promotion, then why should we grieve over a spiritual coronation? If you did your utmost for the one who was gone from sight, if you did everything in your power to prolong his life, if you were kind, helpful, and considerate, there is nothing to grieve about. It is easy during the period of intense grief to find causes for self-condemnation, for regret, for remorse. It is difficult to recall the constructive things one did, the patient steps one took, the impatient words which were held back. Part of the suffering in this area may have a basis in fact, since our ideal usually outruns our performance, but much of it is likely to be fancied. We who are in the flesh can act only within the limits prescribed by our development and understanding. Your loved one, too, was in the flesh, and the responsibility for situations which now grieve you was, in all probability, mutual. There is no occasion for harrowing self-accusations. Do you think that your loved one, which is newfound understanding, is condemning you? With his spiritual discernment, he now sees beneath the thought, beneath the act, beneath the result, and sees only the good. Thou art of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look upon iniquity, said Habakkuk of God whose attributes we share. Try to consider the deceased from his point of view, not yours, and rejoice in his newly attained freedom and his release from the weight of a worn-out or diseased body. There is nothing terrible about slipping out of one body into another, about moving from one plane of consciousness to another. Man is spiritual, and his progress is ever upward. Consider the new world of your loved ones as compared to your own. Think what it means to be living in a state of peace that nothing can disturb. Compare it with the suffering world in which you live. Be frank with yourself. Doesn't your grief tend to turn to envy? Perhaps that is why Jesus told us so little about the next phase of life. Knowing its joys full would have created such dissatisfaction with this mortal phase that we wouldn't want to stay here. Doesn't that thought help you to consider the dead with joy instead of sorrow? Why then do we meet the inevitable with such consternation? Why do we deck ourselves in black raiment and plunge ourselves into paroxysms of suffering? It would be more in keeping with our faith if we thanked God for the joy and happiness which those now gone from our sight once brought to us. You say that you believe in continuing life in a better world beyond. Why don't you act on your behalf? Why don't you let nature take its course without rebelling? If no one died, there would be no room for oncoming generations. What must your loved ones think when they see your tear-dimmed eyes and hear your painful groans? Suppose someone kept you from going all the way with God. Suppose nature called you to make a complete departure from earth, and you were held midway between the old and the new by a grief of some loved one. Don't you see how difficult it must be for your loved one when you keep him earthbound by your human love? Don't you owe something to the one who has started to make the change? It is natural to grieve, and a certain amount of grief is a good thing. It becomes bad, however, when you keep it alive. That is, when you carry it beyond the normal period of mourning. To grieve over a loved one does not benefit him or you, or to capitulate to grief is weak and cowardly. Most grief is selfish. We grieve for the same reason we publicize our aches and pains. We feel sorry for ourselves and want sympathy. That is the purpose of self-pity. It attracts the pity of others. Do you want that? Not at all. It is not pity that you want, but release. You don't want others to suffer because you suffer. You want to help relieve your suffering. That is why you turn to someone stronger and with greater understanding than yourself. The person who helps you most is not the person who sympathizes and commiserates with you, who sinks to your level of unhappiness, but the one who, having risen superior to grief, can show you the way out. Self-pity is to grief what parishionist is to an operation. It is poison. If your grief is free from self-pity, it will heal quickly. If it is fraught with self-pity, it will become infected and spread through your entire body. It is good for you to discuss your problems with your minister or close friends because it is good to get your sorrow out in the open. It is bad, on the other hand, to broadcast your sorrows, that is, to tell them to everyone you meet. The more you syndicate your problem, the more they'll grow. If you do not foster your grief, it will eventually die. You may not accept that statement today when the sun is dimmed and the birds are still and your heart is broken and crushed, but time is always on your side. When everything else fails, time heals. It is inconceivable that you could go on endlessly in your present state of mourning and misery. God has provided for your release by giving you the healing balm that comes with time. You will not forgive the loved one who is gone from your sight, but you will achieve a closer and more intimate relationship with him. Do you understand the principle we are trying to present in this study? Since time heals all wounds, and since we know that time is but a measurement of man's mind, and that there is no time but now, The healing of your grief can take place just as easily while you are reading this page as it can in 6 months or a year. It all hinges on whether you accept the truth now or at some future time. If you accept facts now, you will escape the toll of a protracted and painful mourning. Do you grieve because you think it is the proper way for you to show the respect and love for the departed? Then disabuse your mind of such a fallacious idea at once. The injury of such a grief is twofold. It injures him and it injures you. You must decide, therefore, whether you want to help your loved one or whether you want to hinder him. If you want to help him, you must heal your grief as quickly as possible. This is truly unselfish action. Verse: They shall be comforted. Woven through God's own word, there is a silver thread. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Never a promise fails out of the words he said. Never one word has failed. Cling to it, you who weep. There will come hope again. There will come peace and sleep. Promises God has made, he will not fail to keep. Lift up your weeping eyes. Break off the daily bread. God has taken, and God can keep safely your dear loved dead. Walk with your hand in his. You shall be comforted. Grace Noel Crowell.